Let me, before we get started, give you a little background on JANA Incorporated. We're a technical publications services company which was established in San Antonio, Texas in 1973. And for 43 years, our core business has been the development, management, and delivery of quality technical documentation, and we have a long history in creating, converting, and managing structured data. We also help our clients implement technology that makes it easier to develop and deliver essential technical information to their customers. Through evaluation and collaboration, we understand the complexity of the client's needs. Then we assemble the correct technologies and methodologies to overcome their immediate challenges to achieve their long-term goals. Now I'd like to turn it over to Chip Gettinger, and he can tell you a little bit about SDL.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Chip Gettinger, and many of you may know of SDL. We're a global content management and language solutions vendor, and we were founded in 1992 in Maidenhead, UK, and we have offices worldwide in Europe, North America, as well as Asia. We have over 1,500 enterprise customers and 400 partners in 55 offices in the 38 countries we support. And SDL is a leader in translation management and the global content management, and I look forward to talking about that more today.
Thanks, Chip. Thanks, Joe, as well. Joe, if you want to go ahead and give a little bit of background about each of you, I'm sure that would be a little beneficial.
Sure. Okay, well, like I said, I'm Joe Storbeck, and I'm a senior structured data analyst here at JANA. And I've been in technical communications for over 30 years now, and I have an extensive background in the development and management of structured data. I currently serve on 3 OASIS DITA committees, the DITA Technical Committee, the TechCom and Adoption Subcommittee, and the Lightweight DITA Subcommittee. In the past, I've led documentation teams for a variety of companies, including AIG, Citibank, and IBM. In fact, I was working at IBM during the time that they were developing and rolling out the DITA standard, and I worked directly with the team developing the DITA architecture. Chip, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Joe. I've been in the industry over 20 years. It's longer than that now. My background was in publishing, and more recently, in the last several years, I've been working with global aspects of language and translation, and a very exciting part, my job at SDL is working with our customers and partners around the solutions around content management, and specifically with DITA as a content model. SDL has products that you may be aware of. Our current product is Knowledge Center. Some of you may know it as Live Content, and I work very closely with partners and also in technology areas around deployment. And so, Matt, I think you're going to go over the agenda.
Absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen. So as you can see here, today's agenda, we're going to, each Chip and Joe have both brought some of what they determine to be the top 3 benefits of the DITA standard. So each of them individually will go through their 3 benefits, and then as I briefly mentioned earlier, there will be a Q&A in which you can go ahead and submit questions throughout the presentation. You'll see a questions box on the right-hand side. You can go ahead and submit it through there, and when we get to that Q&A section, we will have your questions addressed by Chip and Joe. But before we begin, Joe and Chip had asked me to submit a poll to our attendees just to help us gather some information to better determine where you're at in the DITA process, if you are just starting your investigation or if you have already gone through the conversion or migration process. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll here, and you can see here the question is, where are you in the DITA journey? Are you just starting your investigation? Are you using it currently at a basic level? Are you an advanced DITA user, or are you not sure? At this time, you can go ahead and just click on whichever answer best suits your specific situation, and then just a couple of more seconds here, we'll get most of the results, and then we'll continue on. So we'll just take a couple of more seconds, but it looks like most of the people that are attending this webinar, Chip and Joe, just for your sake, looks like most of them are just starting their investigation. So they're looking into the DITA standard and potentially looking for some of the benefits. So it looks like about 64% of our attendees are starting their investigation. There are about 20% of our attendees that do consider themselves advanced DITA users, but for the most part, most of our attendees are starting their investigation. So I want to thank everybody for participating in the poll. And at this point, I will go ahead and hand things back over to Joe, and we will begin today's presentation.
All right, thank you, Matt. Well, as Matt mentioned, we're each going to tell you about our top 3 benefits of using DITA, and you'd think that would mean you're going to see 6 benefits. Actually, you're only going to see 5 because Chip and I have one that we're going to share. And Chip, why don't you get started with reuse?
Sure, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Matt, for the polling results. It's good to know where everyone's at in the audience. So, when Joe and I were planning this webinar several weeks ago, reuse probably came up on both of our lists, very top of the mark. It is the #1 item for adoption for DITA and probably our both opinions. And on the next slide, the reason why is reuse really drives consistency. And many of us today deal with the challenges of producing what we call product content, technical documentation, and so forth. And it could be things like user manuals, reference guides, online, data sheets, perhaps you do training, other types of content that are used. And you have redundancies. And the best part about content reuse with DITA is that it allows you to have a consistent message for your customers. And in this example, we have components or topics of content that we reuse or share between our different deliverables. And Joe and I are going to talk about some of the benefits of this over the next few minutes. But the idea is the ability to reuse also provides that real consistent message. So going to the next slide, what are some of the reasons why you want to reuse DITA content? My favorite one of all the consultants is this kind of single source of truth. All of us have gone through the update cycles where we don't always get everywhere we need to update changes to our products. There are new features that come out, there are changes, or there's external changes to your product, and so forth. So really, the whole idea is to think of a single source of truth. So by eliminating redundancies and consistency, it also provides your customers with a much more consistent message. It's frustrating for customers if you're working with unstructured content today. They may read something in the user guide and the training manual could say something different. And so updates become much easier because if you have that single source of content, you update it once, and in DITA, all of its reuse references get updated automatically. We're also going to talk in a bit more about efficient translation because behind the scenes we may be authoring in English, but behind the scenes we have languages that are associated with those topics. The next thing I like to think about is really an intelligent content strategy. There's been a number of really great books written, oops, back one slide, there we go, thanks. There's been a number of great books written by Anne Rockley, Joan Hakos, and several other consultants around intelligent content. I like to think of what's your strategy behind that. The idea behind that is that it's very easy to look at reuse and even overuse it or abuse it. So a lot of times, Joe and I like to think, really you only need about 20, maybe even 30% reuse within your organization to realize a return on investment. I have seen some organizations reach up to 70% reuse if you have the same product that has various configurations, like same product ships in North America, Europe, and Japan that has slightly different configurations. But there are different types of reuse. The most common reuse that we see is reusing a topic in with what's called a DITA map, which is more or less the table of contents. That allows you to use things like introductions or how to install software, very common things that you could reuse across those types of manuals we talked about earlier. A more intricate type of reuse is called a content reference or conref. A conref is very powerful because it's useful for things like caution and warning statements, legal statements, things that repeat quite frequently throughout your documents. And a conref can actually appear inside the topic itself. So it's a very nice way to be able to make updates around those small kind of components or even smaller fragments of content. And finally, there are other types of more advanced type of reuse capabilities with what we call filtering. Conditional content, variables, key references are also used frequently in the DITA spec. I would say these take more advanced planning, but they allow you again to increase your reuse. The thing that we also look at is we really want to balance the flexibility with traceability. I think personally that if you really do look at a common reuse model and you enforce that among your authors, you really want to be able to trace where those updates are being made. So the important part is don't do spaghetti reuse. That's a common term I've heard from friends, where you have over-abused reuse and it's hard to find out where the source content is. On the next slide, around productivity, really we're talking about, you know, reducing and you really avoiding duplicated workflow or work. You also have much lower translation costs and updates are simpler. And Joe, I think you have some wisdom to add to reuse.
Yeah, I sure do. Thanks, Chip. You know, if you can share and reuse your content, the effects on quality and consistency and translation costs are significant. Oasis did a study a couple of years ago, and it showed that many DITA implementations actually recoup their conversion and retooling cost within 12 to 18 months through translation savings alone. That is, they're translating fewer words. When you want to ratchet up the amount of DITA content that can be reused, you have a lot of different options like Chip was mentioning. You can reuse maps, you can reuse topics, sections, maybe common blocks, images, or phrases. Writing a single version of reused content reduces the potential for inaccuracies and inconsistencies across different deliverables and reduces the amount of maintenance that is required to keep the content current. If your information is translated, reusing information also reduces the translation cost because, again, reused information needs to be translated only once. We have a customer right now that has like about 100 different models of data sheets that they need to put out for their product. Well, they realized that when they switched over to DITA so that they could consolidate their work, they realized that instead of having 100 different data sets, they looked to see where there was reuse within the documents, and they were able to go from 100 data sheets to 10. They were able to say, well, this data sheet has models 1 through 10. This second data sheet has models 10 through 21, and so forth. And they were able to save a lot on their production as well as storage costs. Many accuracy problems occur when information about a subject is not consistent in all of the places where the subject is mentioned. For example, one of your users might read a task scenario that describes how to set up a group of parameters to achieve a performance goal. But the reference to those parameters provide a different set of valid values than the values that are mentioned in the task scenario. Faced with inconsistent information, users don't know which instance of the information is correct, and they're going to lose confidence in the product. Maintaining consistency across all of the information for a product or technology isn't easy, especially on large teams where different people are responsible for different parts of the product. When updates are required, you can make the change in one place, the source text, rather than updating multiple copies of the text. Next time you generate output, the changes will be implemented automatically. Product and component names are prime candidates for reuse because they tend to be all over your technical documentation, and they're going to change over time. When the name of a product or component changes, it's much easier to update the name once in a shared file and have that update automatically propagate across all of your files than it is to search and replace the name in every file that is part of an information set. And now I think we'll go ahead. Chip, you want to take your next benefit?
Sure, thanks, Joe, and great suggestions around content reuse. And obviously, the next item that if you have a decent and accurate reuse plan is something called global time to market. Many of us deal with global products, and even if you author in English only, your content could be used outside of North America. It's not unusual for people to have to read English content. So one of the things I like to say on the next slide is thinking about planning for your, yeah, Joe, you want to go to the next slide there, is planning for global content from the very beginning. This is critical. It's not something you plan months into your content creation. It's really important to think about from a perspective of what content's the purpose of the content. I'm sorry, what is the purpose of the content that you're using? How does that going to affect your authors and so forth? What phrases do you need to avoid that may be only American terms and so forth? And even in English-speaking countries such as Australia, Canada, England, and so forth may not understand that. There's just things that we need to think about planning from the beginning, and ideas, Joe, you had a technology are very key to that earlier in the content reuse. So if you plan from the beginning, if we go to the next slide, the real business benefits that we look at then is a much faster time to global markets. The idea then is around the ability to consolidate your authoring, review, and publishing time. There we go. So today with traditional authoring, you have a very serial process. You're doing research and development with your engineering development groups, and you're authoring, reviewing, and publishing content. And then there's a time typically that you do an English release and then you localize that content. Now, in a document-based approach, we're tied to those documents. Now, some companies have been able to squeeze that time, but you're delaying your global release or your global revenue. If you look at the bottom chart here, where we look at topic authoring, the DITA approach, we're able to do things much more concurrently. So the key benefit here is that we can be authoring, reviewing, publishing, and even localizing content all concurrently. Of course, it takes some planning and diligence and governance to make this happen. And also, I'd like to say it's great to think about having a component content management system to be able to manage this concurrency. But the real benefit here is you have a much faster time for global revenue. Many of us may think of this as a cost savings, but your executives within your company, they're going to think about revenue opportunities. So imagine if you went to somebody and said, if we invested in this DITA standard along with an authoring tool and a component content management system, we might be able to shave weeks or months off the time it takes to get our German, Korean, Chinese content out. You will get the attention of your executives because you're producing revenue for your company. So some of the other benefits, if we go to the next slide, please, Joe, is what are some of the basic truths around translation? As mentioned, many of you know SDL is a translation vendor, and there are a lot of quality vendors out there that do work with DITA content and translation, is you really don't want to find content problems during the translation process. Dell is one of our customers, and they gave a lot of good advice at past conferences on this. It's really costly in dollars, but also in reputation because you get delays. This is a very time-sensitive process when you're going through translation, and it does bring up a lot of stress and emotions involved. So by planning early with your vendors, with your translation team, even with your marketing teams about perhaps what languages are required. I mentioned Chinese or Japanese. They have very different fonts that may be required, very different line endings, composition. If you plan these things ahead of time, you're never going to eliminate all the problems and challenges, but at least you'll have the benefits of having a plan put together. So on the next slide, what are the benefits then that we look at, and Joe, you can go ahead and build the slide out, please, is really some of the benefits and best practices is you can really unify your planning for source authoring and translation. Many of our customers have done that. Instead of having different departments, they have the same group with different skills. I'm never going to pretend that a technical communicator will fully be a translation coordinator, but it's nice if they work together on a weekly or even daily basis. So many organizations have established shared services approach where they have skills on the team that can help your organization no matter where they are on the kind of content that's being produced. I also mentioned about working with your translation vendor to make sure that they get test content, they understand some of the intricacies, that no, you don't want to translate the tag names, which has been a problem I've heard of, and so forth. And then finally, as mentioned, really look at a component content management system to manage the source and target languages. Some of you may be using a source code system or SharePoint. It truly does not manage the relationships between the English source content and the target languages and so forth, where a CCMS has those skills and capability and be able to manage that and so forth. Great. So then my final one on the next slide is around multi-channel publishing. This is another important point. It's not unusual for Joe and I to work in organizations and find that the PDF files are created in FrameMaker, the online help could be built in RoboHelp or similar tools, but they're disparate systems. So already we've talked a little bit about content reuse as being really important for driving consistency. And Joe, as you build out this slide, what you find out is that you want to think about expanded delivery channels. So the whole concept then of being able to do multi-channel publishing, single sourcing approaches, you author it once in DITA, and then you can publish it out in many different formats. And I'm sure many of you have seen that it's possible to create PDF files, HTML help, CHM files, ebooks, learning management system, SCORM. These are all common outputs that Joe and I work with on our customers. But when you start thinking about expanding that delivery channel, our customers have new methods they want to be able to deliver. Many of us use mobile devices, tablets. Many of us need to work offline and so forth. So some of the trends that we really look at is, in the older processes on the bottom here where you had lock content, Joe and I talked about reuse. The next thing that we're seeing very much is social networks. It's not uncommon now for customers to look perhaps in LinkedIn forums or even online forums within your company to find solutions. So imagine if you were able to post a link to your documentation saying, oh, I know how to install on Windows 10, and you could link right back to the documentation inside a social network. This is a very common trend that Joe and I see. It's also making content relevant. This is a lot about search and having relative terms come up and making your search hits fit very well. And so areas of classification and faceted searches, as they're called, are DITA advanced capabilities that we can support. We also look at ubiquitous content and how you can display on any device. So today, you don't want to format just for a screen, a large PC screen or a PDF. We all know how difficult it is to read on a mobile phone. So you need to think about how can I support any device. And finally, the trend is going more towards personalized content, away from generic bland content that has to force people. Personalized content allows your customers to have just unique information that they're looking for. And my last slide on the next one, Joe, imagine in the future that if you're working in topics, you have the ability to store them in a centralized repository with the associated what we call the metadata, the information about that content. And then your customers on the right-hand side, based on their profiles, can have variations sent out to them based on how you want to deliver that content. So this is the highly personalized area that we have an ability to deliver and so forth. And Joe, I'm going to hand it back to you to talk about your next subjects.
All right, thank you, Chip. Well, the first one I want to talk about is how DITA can help you create quality technical information. You know, topic-based documentation is tailor-made for users who don't have a lot of time to read, and that is also tailor-made for DITA. Topic-based documentation gets to the point. Each topic answers one question. How do I? What is? What went wrong? In their excellent book, Developing Quality Technical Information, a group of IBM editors and writers put together, identified quality technical information shares 9 different quality characteristics, which they divided into 3 groups of easy to use, easy to understand, and easy to find. Well, DITA allows for all of that. As far as easy to use, using the DITA standard allows you to create documentation that is task-oriented by using your task topics. It's easy to understand. You can eliminate wordiness by following the minimalism concept that is basic in DITA. And also you can be consistent through your reuse, as Chip and I have talked about earlier. Easy to find, DITA topics allows you to separate reference, concept, and task information. And it's also, DITA is optimal for searching and browsing. The last one we're going to talk about today is what I think, at least for me, it was the greatest benefit I had in DITA, and that was SME engagement. Another part of easy to understand is that the material is technically accurate. Well, before DITA, one of the hardest parts of my job as a writer was getting SMEs to review the document. Now, typically, I would send out a PDF of the book to the development team a week before our review date. Theoretically, we would get together on the review day for 2 to 3 hours and review everyone's comments. Like I said, that was theoretically. Actually, the reviewers would show up on the review day without having read the document. And we would spend what was supposed to be a 2 to 3 hour review about the next 5 to 6 hours of everybody reading the book page by page as we were sitting there, like we were in a schoolroom. Then came DITA, and we were able to send topics to the appropriate SMEs, and they could review topics that they were expert in, and they didn't have to bother with the other topics. They would review while we were writing topics for the other SMEs. Subject matter experts who are reviewing the documentation really appreciate being able to quickly find and review their information. And I got to tell you, having a cooperative or a actual enthusiastic reviewer was, to me, one of the greatest benefits of DITA. And that should take us to the end right now. If anybody has any questions.
Yeah, Joe, thank you.
Yeah.
It looks like we did have some questions submitted, and Joe and Chip, both of you want to thank you. All that information was extremely helpful, and so much so that it looks like it generated a few additional questions as well. So looks like one of the first questions that came, they are asking, are there any DITA solutions for publishing to Salesforce?
Chip, do you know of any of that? Anything?
Yes, Joe. I'd be happy to talk to that. And at SDL, we have a couple of customers who had published their DITA content out as HTML and stored it in a knowledge space within Salesforce. So that's the simplest kind of approach that I've seen. And the way we can do that is in SDL, we create what are called global unique IDs or GUIDs. So what that means is we can publish that out as HTML, and that can be imported into the Salesforce as a knowledge article. And you can even publish out updates in the future from a system like SDL and DITA topics that then get converted and stored in there. More advanced use cases I'm seeing now is where we can actually also apply metadata, or what's called a taxonomy. I'm working on a project right now where a customer has the taxonomy of their products within Salesforce, and we're able to apply that back into the SDL Knowledge Center system. So absolutely, we're seeing convergence now between knowledge articles and DITA. The final thing we can do is we can also manage that in multiple languages. So you may have an English, Spanish, Japanese, and Chinese version of that same knowledge center or knowledge base article. We can publish that out in multiple languages, and using those GUIDs, we can maintain the persistency. One last thought about translation is we're seeing machine translation be used more and more for knowledge articles because of the immediacy that you need to get it out to your customers rather quickly. And then you could either keep that machine translation if the quality is good enough, or you could replace it with a human translation at a later time depending on your needs.
Well, great. Thank you, Chip. Looks like the next question that's come through is a little bit of a longer one, so bear with me here. Can you elaborate more about the specific ways in which DITA addresses the needs of mobile consumers? Is it more about authoring strategies, authoring for reuse or smaller topics, chunks of information, or output flexibility, HTML5, responsive outputs generated from DITA elements? Or is it more of a combination of both?
Ooh, Joe, I'll take a first stab, and I'm sure you want to add at this. My first thought about mobile is that, and a lot of the content strategists trend, they really push mobile first, that your mobile strategy has to be part of your content at the beginning. Now, unfortunately, many of us deal with content that was designed for print. Maybe it's in I mentioned Adobe FrameMaker, Microsoft Word, other tools, and we all know it's difficult to read those documents on mobile devices. So my first bit of advice in DITA is called minimalization. Joe touched on it earlier, is that you can really minimize the amount of content that you produce and create. A good friend of mine once said, none of us ever get paid to retire content. We all get paid to produce content. So the first thing you need to do is have a real solid look at how can you consolidate or condense content types. The second big area, and Joe, I know this is something you'll probably want to talk about, is DITA topics are well suited to have just the finite amount of information needed. So instead of having to read a long document, I could read a task or a concept, and I can minimalize that, and I can filter that content appropriate for a mobile device so that it's more responsive when it goes to the device. But Joe, how would you kind of add, what are your thoughts about mobile for this area?
Exactly what you said. The fact that DITA works in topic-based information, and the fact that they ask you to do a concept, a reference, or a task. If you have if you're using some other standard that allows you to mix all of that, it can get it can get very long and complicated to read on a mobile device. The fact that you're using DITA, which asks you to stick to the point and answer one question for that topic, I mean that's ideal for something that is formatted for mobile.
Chip and Joe, thank you for that answer. Next question. It looks like we got a little bit more time for about 2 more questions. The next question came through, says, does DITA require a relook at your processes, or is a DITA adoption more of an old processes with new tools?
Ooh, Joe, you want to take a stab?
I I'll tell you, I know that when we adopted DITA internally at IBM, first off, we tried to use our old processes, and it didn't really work. It seemed we had to go back and do some additional education for our writers around topic-based information and why we were actually using DITA. And so that like I said, it allowed us to change our processes to like, for example, what I was talking about with getting it reviewed. We didn't have to wait till the document was at a certain draft level. We could send out topics for reviews while we were still writing other topics. What do you think, Chip?
Yeah, this is a great conversation. What I tend to say is you will need to build out new processes. I agree with you, Joe, in that when you're looking to adopt DITA, I typically recommend that you connect in with some changes within your own company, your own organization. One of the big ones I've seen over the last several years is the move to agile product development, whether you're software or hardware. I'm even seeing this now in manufacturing and other kind of more traditional organizations where instead of doing a product release every 12, 18, 24 months, you're doing much more frequent releases. So when you start to think about DITA adoption and when you're authoring in topics, you can tie those topics much easier to the agile process within your company. I have 2 customers that actually went through training in agile and stand-ups, and the doc team became part of the stand-ups that they were doing and got to understand the user stories. So they changed their documentation process to map into the customer process, I'm sorry, into their own internal processes. The second thing I look at is that, and Joe's right, there is probably the biggest point about DITA adoption is change management. It requires training, it requires documenting your processes. Amber Swope's a consultant that we work with, and I did a webinar with her earlier this week, and she talked a lot about governance. And the idea is that your writers need to be part of this education. They need to be, part of that change. It is a change going to topics because you're writing much more concise information. And finally, you may or may not, you may no longer have control of the entire book like you did in the old world. So all of these aspects are very important to change over for successful adoption. The last thing I was thinking about is that slide earlier about the global time to market. You want to set some goals for the organization to say, hey, if we get 25% reuse, if we do this and that and this, we're going to shave 6 weeks off, or we're going to change this and so forth. Those are things that they'll understand why things have to change. And finally, your executives will help evaluate you on.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. All right. So just to piggyback on that, another question came in really quick. Joe, you have mentioned that that you've been on a couple of committees around the OASIS DITA. Just for the sake of clarifying, can you clarify exactly what OASIS is for those that don't know?
Sure. Like I said, IBM developed DITA back in, rolled it out internally to IBM writers in 2001. And around 2004, they donated it to OASIS, which is an open source foundation. OASIS stands for, let's see, the Organization for the Advancement of Structured Information Standards. And it's a worldwide consortium that works on the development and adoption of standards for content technologies. And so since OASIS took over DITA, they've produced at least, let's see, we're on version 1.3 now, and working on version 2.0. One of the, anybody can join OASIS. You can join through your company, or you can even join as an individual if you're interested in helping produce the standards around DITA. It's also got a, there's a mailing list on the OASIS site, and the site is www.oasis-open.org. And
Perfect.
there's a site there where you can actually give some feedback on DITA and actually mention what some problems you might be having, or if you have any suggestions for new features.
Thanks,
And
Joe. That sounds like a great
Matt,
resource to have for sure.
I'll add real quick, SDL is a member of OASIS, as is several hundred vendors and other vendors are. So what that means is the compatibility of the DITA standard is very strong across vendors, consultants, and so forth. So consistency. And OASIS is my favorite part behind the DITA standard. Joe, and thank you for your contributions and work, and as well as the committees. It is truly a standard over the last 10 years that have enabled this wide adoption through, you know, the way that the vendors interact and work together.
And Chip, on that note, one of the questions that we received is what type of different companies have adopted the DITA standard, and where might you see it going in the future? Are there specific industries or markets that have adopted the DITA, and again, just where do you see it going?
Sure. So to Joe's point, IBM adopted DITA, being a very manufacturing hardware and software company. So many of the early adopters in DITA were a lot of high-tech companies. Companies like Nokia was one of the very first ones back in 2005, Joe, is when I saw them present on DITA, and I just, my jaw dropped. And then companies like NetApp, VMware, and others were very much early adopters. Where I've seen DITA grow now out of high tech has been in regulated industries. Recently, I've had more customers in finance, insurance, other regulated industries like life sciences, who have audit control, and they need to be able to track changes. They need to have history and versioning and a content management, and DITA works very well. The future of where I see DITA going is in more modular type-based content. So we have medical information providers that are new customers that are providing information around the Affordable Health Care Act, around doctors and nurses getting information on mobile devices, and they've adopted DITA as their content model because of its modularity, and they're still able to produce the traditional PDF print as well as have the, you know, the web delivery and topic-based delivery in mobile devices.
Right. Well, that's great. Thank you, Chip. Looks like we've got a couple more questions here. So this one is a little intricate, so bear with me again. This is a great question, though. So it seems Joe's point about findability is quite relevant to content creators authoring efficiently. But how does DITA support SEO in terms of how DITA markup is rendered for full text search indexers on the web, if personalized, easy, retrievable content is the direction of information online?
Well, the DITA has a robust metadata section in the prologue of each file where you can put in as many keywords or phrases as you need to help with your searches in your search engines.
And Joe, I'll add to that the search, there's the index terms, and the prologue is very useful, and it does work nicely when you have a self-contained kind of search results for HTML5 or CHM kind of approach. What I've seen with larger deployments is taking that and then pushing that out to a web content management system where the index terms are also indexed by kind of the enterprise-wide search and so forth, so that if a customer does a keyword search at, you know, blah blah blah.com, they'll come up. It could come up as a help topic. Most recently, what I'm seeing in newer deployments is integrating in with a taxonomy management system, where the taxonomy has very richer kind of faceted type searches, and then we're actually seeing that kind of metadata being applied to DITA topics to improve the search capabilities. And that the doctor and nurse example I had earlier is this company is using their taxonomy that they developed to help improve the ratios and how classifications and facets. I've often heard what people want to have is retail-like search with online help, what we expect from Amazon and Google, and we'll be able to achieve that with better kind of, metadata and so forth and taxonomies.
Okay, thank you. And again, here's another great question. Can you please talk about the high-level monetary costs of shifting to a DITA platform, and if possible, give some numbers for alternate scenarios or alternative scenarios? So again, talk about the high-level monetary cost of shifting to a DITA platform, and if you have any numbers for an alternative scenario.
Chip, have you got anything on that?
I typically don't like to give out specific numbers because it varies so widely on the number of authors and users and so forth. I think your biggest cost is going to be in your content analysis, your content strategy, and the global aspects of componentizing and moving your content into topic. It's a significant investment. You may need to re-author some content. You maybe can convert some of that content. That is something that a good strategist, and Joe, I know JANA offers workshops along these lines to help companies.
Right. Yeah, it's different for every customer.
Right.
Yeah.
If I look at the costs associated with adoption, I look at a benefit as a result. So earlier I talked about the time to global markets. I've had several customers who've paid back their investment in DITA and a content management system within 12 to 18 months based on cost savings in translation, or perhaps faster time to revenue. So my suggestion would be look at your business benefits, that if we can shorten our time for translation, or we can avoid having to retranslate content with our old system, and topics allow you to have much more granularity. And as Joe said, there's documented savings with it. You'll find that you can typically get a payback within 12 to 18 months on your investment.
Well, great. Thank you. So this next one here comes from someone again, I just think this is a great question. While I understand the concept of reuse, wouldn't a burst version of DocBook achieve the same results?
I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. I mean, I could see where you could come close, but I think the way our customers, especially the customer I mentioned with the 10 different or 100 different models, they were actually using DocBook, and they weren't able to get the kind of reuse that DITA offered, and that's one of the reasons why they moved to DITA.
And Joe, to add to that, when I interview authors who are using DocBook, the reality is that very few trust the reuse within DocBook. What that means is if you create the reuse, you reuse your content. In a shared collaborative environment, there's just not that trust level in that bursting kind of approach with DocBook. I've seen personally with large groups that can be, more than 10 authors, where when you look at DITA, you have standalone topics and conrefs and keys that are very easy to manage and also have accountability for them. And when you have a CCMS, you can actually add security on there, so only the super users can update the source reuse. Then I see reuse go skyrocket through the roof because the authors then trust the single source approach.
Great, thank you. And then last question for today is kind of straight to the point. I appreciate the question. Some companies promote DITA as an open standard that can be migrated to alternative tools if needed. Does that really happen?
So I'll tell you a trend I'm seeing. I've been in DITA now for 12 years. This is my second vendor. I've been at SDL 8 years. One of the trends I'm now seeing are mature DITA organizations move to new CCMSs or move their DITA content. And they've proven that they made the right investment perhaps 6, 8, 10 years ago, and now they want to move from, let's say, a SharePoint storage to more repository that SDL or other vendors provide. So that's one clue that I've had is that companies have made the right investments and did it as an interchange standard. The second thing I'm seeing is organizations that end up merging. Some of you may know that EMC and Dell both just converged into a single company, and both companies use DITA as well as VMware. So Oracle is another big DITA user as well as DocBook, but I'm seeing Oracle has acquired a number of organizations that have been authoring in DITA, and we're able to merge their DITA content together better than the older standards. I don't know, Joe, if you have anything to add there.
Not really. I mean, the examples that you've used were something I would have mentioned as well. So.
Great. Well, that looks like that is the end of our Q&A session. I want to thank everybody for submitting those great questions, and then Chip and Joe for your outstanding answers as well. At this point, I'll go ahead and hand it back to Joe and Chip for some closing remarks.
Sure. Well, Chip, thank you very much for joining us, and I think I had a good time here, and I think we got some good information across to our listeners. And if anyone has any additional questions, here's our contact information.
And Joe, I want to thank you and Matt for the opportunity to co-present with you. It's a real pleasure. It was fun prepping for this, and I agree. I really appreciate the questions from the audience. And I know, Matt, this was also recorded, so if people had to drop off early, or if you want to have other people in your organization watch this, Matt, there's going to be a recording coming out, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Chip and Joe, thank you both for your outstanding presentation today. And to all of our attendees, thank you for joining. You will see a follow-up email after this webinar that will provide you with a link to the recording that you can share with any other people that might have some interest, or if you want to review this as well. You'll see that via an email upon completion of this webinar, probably later today or tomorrow. But again, we just want to formally thank everybody on behalf of JANA as well as SDL. Thank you for attending today, and don't hesitate to reach out to either of us if you have any questions or there's anything you need any help with. But on that note, we hope everybody has a great day. And again, from JANA and SDL, thank you very much.